So, welcome. How are you? Okay, I know it's Sunday. It's been an amazing weekend, So I'm going to be talking about communication today, which is an area that I've been working in for a very long time. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Joy. I'm a psychologist, and a lot of my writing is about the psychology of eating animals, the psychology of Carnism, and communicating in a way that increases our effectiveness and increases the chances that our message will be heard as we intend it to be, and that really supports the growth of the vegan movement. And so, you know, what I love doing is I love being able to stand in front of a group of vegans and share good news, like the fact that the vegan movement is growing exponentially all over the world. And I love being able to tell you guys that. And that's true. Today, however, I'm going to be talking about something else that's growing in the movement, which is a virus of sorts. It's a virus that is contagious and debilitating and potentially even deadly. But there's good news even in this, because when we become aware of this virus, we have the opportunity to halt its spread, to reverse its course, and to heal and empower our movement. And the virus I'm talking about is toxic communication among vegans. Now, before I define what I mean by this, I'm going to just give you some examples, and I apologize for the profanity, but you know, they came off Facebook and YouTube, so what are you going to do? These are comments that were made to people who I know to be very committed, hardworking, deeply caring vegans. And these were comments that were made because those vegans said or did something that other vegans disagreed with. Now, I'm sure you have seen this kind of commentary before. In fact, I'm actually curious, how many of you here have witnessed toxic communication among vegans? I really am very curious. Okay, so that's like just about everybody. Has anybody in this room actually been the target of toxic communication yourself? How many of you have been? Okay, so you've had stuff posted about you, or said to you, maybe, although a lot of it happens online. I mean, I can relate. I've also been the target of toxic communication, and for me, it was so bad that at one point I seriously questioned whether I could continue to work in this capacity, the capacity that I work in the movement, which was upsetting for me because I believe that I'm using the best, you know, I'm doing what I'm doing, which is the best use of my talents and my skills. And so my impact for animals would be reduced if I changed what I was doing. But at the same time, I was really asking myself, can I be sustainable in this way? And I have heard from so many vegans, countless vegans around the world, you know, they've shared with me these very often tearful and painful stories of their experience of being the target of toxic communication. Some of them had been brilliant organizational leaders who had left their work because they couldn't tolerate it anymore. And in my observation, many vegans end up leaving the movement, not because they can't withstand the pressures of the dominant carnistic culture, but because of this sense of betrayal and demoralization they experience when they are on the receiving end of toxic communication from other vegans. The vegan movement no longer feels like a safe place for them. Can you guys relate to this? Have you seen it, and can you relate? Yes. So it's really quite a serious problem, and that's why I'm focusing on it today. And I'm going to start out by sharing with you how I'm defining toxic communication. I'm defining toxic communication as any communication that violates our integrity and harms the dignity of others. By integrity, I am referring to the integration of core moral values, most notably compassion and justice, and practices. So we violate our integrity whenever we communicate in a way that doesn't reflect compassion and justice. By dignity, I'm referring to one's sense of intrinsic worth. It's the feeling of being fundamentally worthy as a being on this planet. So we harm another's dignity whenever we communicate in a way that they are less than, they are morally inferior, when we shame them. Now I'm going to take a couple of minutes to just talk about shame because this is such a fundamental aspect of toxic communication, impact of toxic communication. And I want to start out by differentiating shame from guilt. Does anybody here know the difference between shame and guilt? What do you think it is? You can... What is it? Who's inflicting it? We can actually do both to ourselves and we can do both to others, but that's a logical assumption.
Shame is saying you are bad, guilt is saying you've done something.
Exactly. Guilt, we often use these terms interchangeably, but guilt is how we feel about a behavior, right? We feel guilty when we think I've done something bad. Shame is how we feel about ourselves. When we feel shame, we feel I am bad. Shame is the feeling of being less than. More specifically, it's the feeling of being less worthy than, being morally inferior, of our fundamental worth not being valid, not being enough. Shame is arguably one of, if not the most disruptive and destructive of all human emotions. Most of us carry around a tremendous amount of shame because there's an epidemic of shame in our culture and in many cultures around the world. We've been born into a deeply non-relational world where we learn to interact with each other and often with ourselves as well in ways that communicate that we are less than. And most of us carry around shame. And most of us are highly defensive against experiencing further shame, further harms to our dignity. I often say that the best way we can get somebody to do the opposite of what we want them to do is to shame them. Shamed people withdraw or attack in self-defense. They wrap themselves in the emotional armor necessary to protect themselves from feeling further shamed. Shamed people are not people who feel that they have the agency to take proactive action on behalf of themselves or others. So shame is shame is shameful for us. We hide our shame from others and we also hide our shame from ourselves. We learn to feel ashamed of feeling shame. So when we're looking at others and interacting with others, we're not aware of what they're carrying inside. And this incredible vulnerability that we all have to feeling even less than many of us are already feeling. Research has shown that when people experience shame, they exhibit a stress response. They become defensive. When you exhibit this defensive stress response, that means that you're in some sort of a state of fight or flight, basically. You know, it could be more or less. So you have less access to your rationality, your rational faculties, and you're less connected to your empathy. So you become more defensive. And many people who feel shame try to offset their feeling of shame by shaming others. If I feel less than, then I'll make you feel less than, and that'll make me feel better than, for a little while anyway. Can you relate to some of this? So shame is contagious. Shame is deeply problematic, and it also is contagious. And in fact, all toxic communication is contagious. There's been a lot of really interesting research on toxic communication recently. So some studies have found that being exposed to just one incident of rude behavior, like reading an insulting email, can cause people to reproduce negative behaviors. Other studies have shown that many studies actually have shown that for every hurtful interaction we have, it takes at least 5 positive ones to offset the harm to our mood and also the drain to our energy. And studies have found that people automatically mimic the facial expressions, the tone, the postures of others. And spectators to the encounter do the same. And when we see people making hurtful or negative expressions, such as like frowning or glaring, we actually feel angrier or worse ourselves. So researchers that look at emotional contagion say that toxic communication, toxic interactions, they spread like the common cold. So just imagine the impact of toxic communication when it's expressed not just in a one-to-one interaction, but by someone who's influencing hundreds or thousands of others. Somebody who's blogging, somebody who's posting on Facebook where their comments are widely read, somebody who's standing on a stage. And just imagine the increase in this impact when the person is in a position of authority. So those of us who are in positions of leadership we have a special responsibility to be extra careful to use our influence so that we offset and we don't reinforce this level of toxicity. Our toxic communications are creating an epidemic of suffering, and they are causing tremendous damage to vegans, vegan organizations, and the movement. And I believe that they need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed with urgency. I'm going to share with you just some of the costs. And I'm going to share with you research that's been done looking at toxic interactions, which are primarily toxic communications in workplaces. And this research can be easily extrapolated to vegan organizations and to the vegan movement as a whole, which is its own system. Can you tell that that's an iceberg with a $sign under it? Good, because all the people I showed this to before were like, oh, that's a funny looking iceberg. And I thought it was such a cool slide that I found. Good, it worked. Or maybe I just primed you. So, so studies of toxic behaviors in the workplace have shown that they cause a wide variety of problems. And I'm going to just share some of them with you here. Oops. I'm assuming you can see in the back, because I can't read as quickly as these are popping up. So these problems were found not only among staff in organizations or in companies that were the targets of toxic interactions or toxic communication, but also among the first-hand witnesses, which were other staff who witnessed these interactions, and also the second-hand witnesses, which are friends and family who hear about these stories, after the fact. Studies have also shown that in a group, just one person who engages in toxic communication, toxic behaviors, reduces the group's performance by 30 to 40%. I mean, think about this. Think about this in the context of a movement of people who are largely volunteer, who are already tired, who are already drained in energy much of the time, a movement that needs all the help it can get. Studies that have looked at just the financial costs of what they're calling a toxic workplace, and they're defining that as a workplace where 15% of the staff, which is not a lot in my experience, engage in toxic interactions. They looked at a staff of 1,000 and assessed the financial damage. This is not even the emotional and physical damage, the financial damage alone, to be over $2 million. So we did some interesting configuration. We estimated, well, what would the costs be? If we extrapolated some of these findings to a vegan organization, what would the costs to that organization be? Now, we didn't, this is kind of a thought experiment. So we didn't take into account the fact that there are high rates of trauma and burnout among vegans, or that there's less leadership training. We didn't take into account factors like vegans being committed to the cause. So we just looked, we just made a direct comparison. So if we have a vegan organization of 100 people, that would be approximately toxic interactions, or a toxic workplace would result in $200,000 in lost productivity. In an organization of 10 people, that would be $20,000 in lost productivity. Now, if we looked at an organization, we thought about, an efficient vegan advocacy organization. That means a vegan advocacy organization that's operating, fairly efficiently. And we're focusing on advocacy organizations, not like sanctuaries or rescue organizations, because the costs look very different. According to animal charity evaluators, $1 can spare 1 animal. So what that means is that in the organization of 10 people, if that's a toxic workplace, that could result in 20,000 animals not being spared. Now I wrote here being killed, but what it really means is not being spared, not being saved. And in an organization of 100 people, that could result in 200 animals not being spared. Now, of course, as I said, these figures are estimates based on empirical data of workplace productivity and financial and ACE analyses. So there's going to be a lot of wiggle room, but even if it's 1 animal, that's 1 animal too much for me. Even if the cost is 1 animal, that's probably 1 animal too much for everybody in this room. And in my estimates, and I believe that actually these figures probably would be much higher if we really did a comprehensive analysis. So we have a problem. I think an imperfect yet perhaps useful analogy is to think of farmed animals as being in a sinking ship, with their main hope of survival being the lifeboats that are personed by vegans. Vegans who are already working tirelessly to paddle against the tides of Carnism. Every toxic communication is like shooting a hole in the bottom of the animal's lifeboat. They need us to do better. So before I move on and talk about how we can do better and how we can shift this dynamic, I want to talk a bit about what are some of the causes of toxic communication among vegans. Now, there are a lot of causes, but I'm just going to look at 3 of them, three key causes, in my opinion. One is that most communication is online. And studies have shown, I don't even think we needed studies to show this, but studies have shown that it's a lot easier to be nasty to somebody when you're not looking them in the eye. So whenever possible, it's really important to communicate face to face. It makes a tremendous difference in our ability to interact with each other in a relational, compassionate way. Another reason is because the broader climate, this is beyond the vegan movement. We live in a toxic emotional and intellectual climate. So toxic communication has become so normal as to be unremarkable. It's just normalized behaviors for us. Sorry, I'll get rid of him quickly. I'm trying to. Okay. And the third reason I chose to look at is because in our movement, and this is true for other social justice movements as well, but I'm focused on our movement. In our movement, there are very high rates of traumatization in the movement, or high rates of what is referred to as STSD, secondary traumatic stress disorder. STSD is exactly like PTSD. You guys know post-traumatic stress disorder, except that it's got one key difference. Does anyone know what that difference is? That's right. STSD impacts the witnesses to the violence, whereas PTSD impacts the direct victims of violence. Now, there are many consequences of STSD, and I'm going to list just a few of them here. One key consequence is that having STSD can cause us to create what I call a trauma narrative. A trauma narrative it's a lens that we look at the world through. When we become traumatized, we start to look at the world as though it's one giant traumatic event with only 3 roles to be played. You can either be a victim or what else? A perpetrator or a hero. I don't use witness because a witness can be a perpetrator if they don't take action, or they can be, or positive action, or they can be a victim. And sometimes they're both. So you can be a victim, witness, or a hero in the trauma narrative. And what happens is the more traumatized we become, the more rigidly we place everyone, including ourselves, into one of these roles. And we lose the capacity for nuance. We lose the capacity to recognize that good people can engage in harmful behaviors and that doesn't make them bad people. We lose the capacity to recognize that if we're not perfect vegans all the time, that doesn't mean, we're not heroes and therefore we're perpetrators. And many vegans project this onto other vegans. Well, you're not a perfect vegan hero? Well, then you're part of the problem. I suggest that it can be useful to think of trauma as having a survival instinct. Think of your trauma. How many of you can relate to some of this, actually? So I highly recommend, in my book, Beyond Beliefs, which I have here for sale at the Lantern Books table, and it's about communication and relationships between vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. It's also for vegans and vegan-vegan interactions, and I have a whole chapter on STSD in there. It's really important to get informed about this. When we recognize the symptoms of STSD, we're in a much better position to reverse the course of this problem. It can be helpful to think of trauma as being an entity that's taken up residence in our psyche. And it's an entity with a survival instinct. Your trauma wants to stay alive. And the way that it gets itself to stay alive is by convincing you to feed it. And it wants you to feed it with material that traumatizes you, that creates these traumatic thoughts and feelings within you. So one of the most important things to do is to not over-witness. If you've seen graphic imagery of animal suffering, if you know what's going on and you're already actively a part of the solution, you don't need to take any more of that in. Protect yourself from over-witnessing, protect others from over-witnessing. Many vegans have said to me that they're afraid that if they stop witnessing, they're going to stop caring. And I would suggest that that is your trauma talking. And to give yourself permission to let your trauma go. I think that's one of the most important things we can do for our movement. If we bring our trauma into our activism, we are in danger of creating the very thing we're seeking to transform. Now, this toxic climate that I was talking about, emotional intellectual climate and trauma and online culture, create this sort of moral perfectionism where we end up holding others and ourselves to these impossible standards, right? One unexamined or even selfish choice or statement suddenly makes someone bad. It suddenly makes them the enemy. I mean, we're all going to screw up. We all have unexamined parts of our psyches. We're all selfish sometimes. That's part of being human. But we live in this climate of moral perfectionism, which is an impossible ideal, and I wouldn't even say it is an ideal in some ways. And the ethos, therefore, of the movement and even beyond, this backdrop of the movement and beyond, is one in which we not only tolerate, but we actually celebrate this moral perfectionism and toxic communication. I have seen vegans cheering other vegans on as they attack people in this movement, a movement that needs all the help it can get. I've seen people cheer other vegans on as they attack non-vegans, the very people we need to invite into our movement if we hope to do any good for the animals whose lives are depending on us. So we tend to rally around the battle cry of people who, the battle cry of those who raise the battle cry of this moral righteousness. And we end up believing that it's all right to abuse others as long as you're morally righteous. We tend to check our critical thinking at the door when we hear this battle cry of moral righteousness. This person is passionate, they're taking a moral stand, therefore they must be accurate. But research has shown that anger, when we witness people who are angry, we are less critical and less rational in our assessment of them. So we are less rational when it comes to assessing the behaviors of angry people. We actually perceive them as more believable, more competent, and more intelligent than they actually are. So we have to be very careful not to buy into this paradigm, this way of thinking that it's appropriate to be abusive or to engage in toxic behaviors just because we're morally outraged. Now, moral outrage is not always a bad thing. You know, there's appropriate anger. Sometimes anger it's healthy. Healthy anger is anger is a natural, legitimate response to injustice. Our anger motivates us to stand up and demand change. So I am not talking here about, I am not saying here that we shouldn't be angry. There are things to be angry about. But how we relate to our anger matters very much. And if we assume that our anger gives us license not to practice basic human decency toward others, we can end up feeding rather than fixing the very problem we're angry about in the first place. The very problem we're trying to perform in the first place. Healthy anger is anger that we can observe, we can recognize, but that hasn't hijacked us. Our anger is healthy when we can feel it, but we're not looking at the world through the lens of the anger. We're still looking at the world through our own eyes. Healthy anger is anger that is, as I said, a response to injustice, but it doesn't hold the charge of contempt. A sign that anger is not healthy, a sign that anger, or I should say being expressed in an unhealthy way, is when it is communicating contempt, when it is communicating that the other, regardless of what they've done or who they are, is somehow fundamentally unworthy, less worthy, morally inferior. I'm not saying we shouldn't be holding people accountable. We need to hold people accountable, no question. But how we do that matters. It matters in terms of our own ethics and who we want to be in this world. It matters in terms of what we are contributing, what kind of consciousness we want to be feeding in our own movement, and it matters strategically. Because when we communicate in a way that is not reflecting healthy anger, then we're turning people off rather than inviting them in. And I want to be very clear. I am not talking about tone policing here. Tone policing is basically suggesting that emotion doesn't have a place in communication, and it's used as an excuse not to engage in difficult communications because the person who's communicating has an emotional charge to their tone. Emotions, can be valid and are very, very important. It's how we communicate, how we relate that matters. So we need to move beyond this toxic perfectionism. We need to appreciate that we have inherited a messy world. We did not create the mess that we find ourselves in. We were born into it. Nevertheless, we have to navigate in it. We have to recognize that in this messy, complicated, completely screwed up world that we have been born into, that is a deeply non-relational and dysfunctional world that we have been born into, we need to make choices that are different than those that we would make in an ideal world. We have to live with contradictions in ourselves and in others. This is not an excuse to do nothing. It is simply saying that we need to create space and acceptance in ourselves and for others, even as we work toward self-growth and social change. Maybe we feed our sick cats meat. In an ideal world, there wouldn't be any meat, and we probably wouldn't even have any cats living with us. But that's what we've inherited. So we need to stop reproducing the toxic perfectionism and the toxic communication of the dominant culture. We need to do this for ourselves as individuals, for our movement, and ultimately for the animals. And we can do better. I know we can do better. The vegan movement exists as a counterpoint to those attitudes and behaviors that are toxic in the dominant culture. So I'm going to talk now about, there are many, many tips. The original version of this had 24 tips. And then my program manager said, oh, that's a book. And I was like, no more books for a while. So 8 tips to help prevent and reverse the spread of toxic communication. So we need to first take a look at ourselves to examine ourselves and our behaviors. And we know that many people have inflated beliefs about how well they actually treat and are seen by others. Keeping this in mind, also ask yourself to pay attention to the company you keep. Are you surrounding yourself with people who communicate in a way that you want to rub off on you? Remember, toxicity is contagious. Whoever you surround yourself with will determine in large part how you think and how you feel and how you interact. We also need to become critical consumers of what we put in our minds and hearts, just like we are of what we put in and on our bodies. So, we need to learn to notice the signs of toxic communication, such as shouting. When somebody is writing in all capital letters with multiple exclamation points, this one little change can tone down a communication quite a bit. And again, it's not taking the emotion out of the communication. It's communicating in a way that doesn't suggest shouting. Absolutes, for example, saying men use sexist language rather than some men use sexist language, just a qualifier so that we're not being absolute in our communication. Character assaults, for example, saying she's speciesist because she says or does something speciesist. We are all going to say and do things that do not reflect an ideal awareness of our various privileges, and here I'm talking about human privilege. We can work to improve those without having our characters assaulted in the first place. Hyperbole, which is making exaggerated claims rather than sticking to the facts. So saying Joe's malicious statements. How do we know if his statements were malicious? Because malicious suggests intention to harm. We don't know that. What we can say is Joe's statements that were experienced, that I experienced, as hurtful. And defining reality. That means making ourselves the experts on others' experiences. When we define somebody else's reality, we basically act like we're mind readers. We know what they're thinking and feeling better than they do. So saying something like, he doesn't care about animals. He's just an activist because he's trying to feed his ego. And of course, any comment or any communication that suggests that the other is somehow less than, that is shaming. And I just want to share a note of caution. I see this a lot in our movement and also beyond. Intellectual and academic critiques are very important, in my opinion, very useful, but they can be and often are, in fact, toxic communications that are hidden beneath big words and prose and attractive prose. So be a critical consumer, read between the lines. Just because somebody speaks well or writes well or is communicating, a seemingly very intelligent analysis, it doesn't mean that they are not being shaming in the process of that. So it's very important to be aware of this. We need to be able to create a healthy process in our communications. Now, in all communications have two parts. They have the content and the process. Does anybody know what the content is? It's the what. It's what we are talking or communicating about, and the process is, it's the how. It's how we are communicating. In communications, the process matters more than the content, although people tend to focus more on the content than the process. The process matters more. Think about a conversation you had last week or last year. Possibly you have forgotten the entire content. You don't even remember what you talked about. But probably you still remember how you felt in that conversation. The process determines how we feel. A process can be healthy or unhealthy. When our process is healthy, it is relational. Our goal is mutual understanding. We may still seek to advocate change later, but our primary goal needs to be mutual understanding. Words, communication is what we use for one reason and one reason only, because we're not telepathic. Words and our communication are the only way that we have of telling other people what we think and feel and understanding what other people think and feel. So in a healthy conversation or communication, the goal is mutual understanding. In an unhealthy communication, there can be many goals that are not that. Very often, the goal is to be right, which means that you make the other person wrong, or the goal is to win, which means you make the other person lose, right? So, rarely are differences a problem when people are communicating. We're going to have differences in methodology and strategy and ideology, as our movement grows and becomes broader and more diverse. It's how we relate to our differences that matters. When our process is healthy, we can talk about just about anything without arguing. And when our process is unhealthy, we can't talk about anything without arguing. So process is the key. A healthy process is the key. We also need to protect boundaries, our own boundaries and the boundaries of others. We need to start to hold toxic communicators accountable and not be bystanders. Pay attention to what comes through your feed. Pay attention to what you let sit on your page. Pay attention to what you forward to other people. What kind of consciousness do you want to be perpetuating in the world and letting into your own world? We should delete toxic comments when appropriate and not forward them. Block people when appropriate and when we've talked to them and they don't change. And avoid the temptation to read toxic commentary. Toxic commentary has an addictive pull to it. But like any addiction, it ultimately ends up destroying us. And leave groups that tolerate or encourage toxic communication and report them to people who run those groups. So protect boundaries and don't perpetuate the problem. Toxic communicators, people who are like repeat offenders, toxic communicators, would not have the impact that they do if they didn't have a platform, and they wouldn't have a platform if all the rest of us didn't allow that to happen. We also need to stay connected to our empathy as long as it's safe. In some situations, staying connected to empathy is not safe. When you have less power in an interaction and you don't trust the other person with the power, there are a variety of reasons. But to the best of your ability, if you feel safe enough, stay connected to your empathy when you're communicating. Empathy is the antidote to contempt, and contempt is the cornerstone of toxic communication. It drives it and it reflects it in this feedback loop. Remember that what's in agreement are ideas, not people. And it's a really good idea to pause before communicating, before you hit send. Like, just take 5 minutes, wait, sleep on it. It can make a huge difference. I also recommend putting a sticky note next to your computer, which is where most toxic communication happens, to remind yourself that the individual on the other end of your communication is a being with a life that matters to them, a being with feelings, and a being who is vulnerable to being hurt and being harmed by shaming and toxic communications. Make the connection. I also recommend speaking to an individual if you're not happy about something. If you're frustrated with another vegan or another human being, speaking to them privately rather than in public. Sometimes public communication is necessary. But if there's a person who's willing to have a conversation, or who you haven't given the opportunity to have a private conversation, it's basic respect to give them the option of doing that first. No one is not vulnerable to the debilitating effects of shame. And as I've been saying, make it your goal, no matter how upset you are, to honor the dignity of others when you're communicating, and pay attention to whether others are doing this or not in their communication. Honor the dignity of others. If you are in a place where you're so upset about something and somebody else has done something that's so offensive that you really feel that it's not safe to stay connected to your empathy, and that's valid, that you're just not in a place to feel like you can honor the other person's dignity, and that's valid too, then you can choose to not communicate in that circumstance. We need to stop the spread of the problem. Be extremely skeptical of anyone who argues that it is ever appropriate to communicate without compassion and respect. I don't know a single study that suggests this. And in fact, most of the evidence I am aware of is just the contrary. And please do not confuse compassion, practicing compassion, with weakness or passivity. We're not talking about passivism here. Practicing compassion takes a lot of strength. And I would suggest it takes a whole lot more strength to stay connected to your compassion when you're communicating in a difficult situation, and to show up and be present, than it does just to punch back like the rest of the dominant culture is doing. And finally, remember our shared bond. When I witness the way that vegans communicate with each other, often, not always, but often, I am so saddened, because we have this bond. This bond is completely absent from those communications. We, as vegans, we carry a heavy burden with us. We have to live with the awareness that every second horrific suffering is unfolding, and that no matter how hard we work, we will very likely not live to see the end of it. And this collective knowing and this collective caring that we have, it's a sacred bond we share. Nobody else is seeing the world the way that we are seeing it. We need to honor that bond so that our movement is a safe place, so that our movement is the inspirational space that we need, so we can keep doing this exhausting and incredibly difficult and vitally important work of working for liberation. We need each other to do this. When I think about what we live with, we live in the midst of a global atrocity that only we can see. We spend our lives picking up the pieces of the mess left behind by others. And our efforts are invisible at best, and often they're even ridiculed. We carry a heavy burden, and we will never really be thanked for what we do. Many people are never thanked. When I got to that point where I really questioned if I could keep working at this capacity, what brought me back, what restored my belief that I could, was the vegans who shared with me how my work had helped them, how my work had helped them help the animals and help the world. And I was so grateful for that validation. I was so grateful to hear that appreciation. Many vegans never get a single thank you. The animals will never thank us. So we need to show each other that our caring and our efforts matter. It's so important, and they do matter. We are doing amazing work in this world. At the moment, we are the primary hope that the animals have. And we're doing a great job, and we can do better at it. So I want to just take this opportunity to say thank you to you. I want to thank you for all that you are and for all that you do. I want to thank you for keeping me inspired in the way that you do. And I want to thank you for having the courage to live your truth in this very difficult world that we live in every single day. Thank you for having the courage to keep living the truth, living your truth so that the animals can one day live theirs. Thank you all. Thank you.